Welcome to the second webinar in our three-part series on energy modeling for better policymaking. This webinar is focused on and approaches the question of how can we use energy models to resolve challenges, actual energy sector challenges, be they dispatch, renewables integration, power trading, understanding of different energy pathways. How can policy making be improved in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia through modeling? So this being the second webinar, our third webinar and last, therefore, of the series will take place on the 27th of May. Please visit our EEG program website for information or to watch indeed a recording of our first webinar that took place a couple of weeks ago. My name is Ben Kloos, and I'm the Head of Research and Engagement for the Applied Research Program on Energy and Economic Growth. I'm Senior Consultant at Oxford Policy Management, and I've previously worked in the energy industry in a range of economic, planning, and strategy roles. The Applied Research Program on Energy and Economic Growth, or EEG, is a 5-year program led by Oxford Policy Management, OPM, and is funded by the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. It produces cutting-edge research on the links between energy and economic growth. And by pioneering this kind of research, we hope to promote evidence-based programming policymaking and ultimately help bring the benefits of modern energy to all. We also host a roundtable on energy planning that promotes progress in that area. From OPM side, I'm joined by Simon Trace, the Program Director of the EEG program, and Simon will help ensure that questions you, the audience, ask are answered in this webinar. I'm joined, most excitingly, by 4 truly outstanding experts, our panelists today. Each of them is an authority in their field, and each of them also leads some of our innovative EEG research. Dr. Chattopadhyay is a senior energy specialist at the World Bank Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, ESMAP. Dr. Jyoti Parikh is the Executive Director of Integrated Research and Action for Development, IRADe. And among many roles, she was a member of the Prime Minister of India's Council on Climate Change. Dr. Ranjit Deshmukh is an assistant professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, joining at a very early hour today. Thank you. And Dr. Will Usher is an assistant professor at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology. Just before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules. You, the attendees, will not be visible or audible in this webinar, but please ask questions. And the way to do it is that at the bottom of your screen, you'll find a Q&A function. In that, you can ask questions at any point throughout this webinar, and we will attempt to answer them as much as possible. There's also a chat item where you can leave comments or reflections. And again, it's something we can come back to during this webinar. I should say also in the Q&A function, you have the opportunity to vote up questions if you want, so you can vote your favorites and really make sure that we don't forget those. This webinar is being recorded and will ultimately be available through the EEG website. So let's make a start. Starting with you, perhaps, Jyoti. Given your extremely broad experience in both policy making and research, and with reference to your EEG project, what do you think is the relevance of modeling of the electricity sector? Why is modeling important?
Modeling helps us to track the alternative futures and compare the differences between various policies. And also it removes a lot of apprehensions that people have. And in our case, we used it really to get many things going. When we began in 2013, there was in India, there was a feeling that if we have everybody is short of electricity, and how can we trade? So that's not possible. That's the kind of approach, apprehension people had. Bangladesh has other types of. Nepal thought, what if we do all the investments and India doesn't buy? Bangladesh has some another. So one by one, we were able to tackle all these apprehensions to show that everyone benefits, and that and whatever question they had, we were able to make a policy scenario out of it, and it was a very exercise of conversation and stakeholder consultation. We had something like 30 consultation that time, actually many more. And so one by one, we could deal with their apprehensions. To give example, the research showed that Nepal by itself, if it does not trade, can at the most for its own demand exploit 15 gigawatt of power potential. But if it trades, then it can do 44 gigawatts. So the remaining will give Nepal economic growth, export earnings, and also industrialization and increased energy access, and all these things that one expects energy sector to do. See similar things about Bhutan. Just tell me how many minutes I can go on for. So similarly in Bhutan, we could see that in 90s it started with per capita income half that of India, and within 1.5 decades it had twice as much per capita income, and most of it began that the whole cycle began with power sector development, and it then created roads, and then roads led to tourism, and so on. So one after another, Bhutan became far more prosperous than it was before. And in India's case, we were able to, we are and will be a lot more able to pump renewable energy in our grid, because we have big plans of 450 gigawatt by 2030, and that requires also hydro support at certain hours. So that would be also possible.
Thank you. And Deb, moving on to you. We heard here about the importance of thinking about renewables and power trade in a number of countries. What is your take on which methodological approach to adopt to ensure efficient electricity dispatch, given your EG study of Nigeria, Pakistan, and Bangladesh?
Thank you, Ben, and hello, everyone. Yeah, so to complement what Dr. Parikh just said, which is more on the planning side, with the dispatch, we are much closer to actual system operation. And the studies that we have done at the World Bank as part of EEG, as well as other studies, it literally involves going into the system control center, the load dispatch center, and actually look at what they have done in reality, what they say past 1 year, and then develop a dispatch model to create an optimized counterfactual, if you like. And the difference often turns out to be very significant, not necessarily in terms of the actual volume, but the economic benefit of moving to an optimized dispatch could be massive. And purely as a methodology, that economic dispatch model has been known for 40 years. It has, of course, grown in complexity with new technologies, renewables, etc. But it's not hard to implement one of those. I mean, we typically can develop one of those models in a month. But then I think the methodology is as much about creating a dialogue with the system operator, policymakers, and so on, to peel off various rules that the system operator often imposes, because that's how they have always run the system. And especially at a time when the power systems are going through a transition, it's very important to question those rules. So the methodology allows us to peel off one constraint. For example, if they were operating hydro in a particular way, if you remove that constraint, optimize hydro, what is the additional gain? So I think that provides a wonderful opportunity for us to actually look at a range of constraints and how they can be removed. It could be a physical constraint on transmission bottlenecks within system that we can identify, and we have identified projects in Bangladesh through the EEG project to do that. And it could be also soft inefficiency purely on the sort of, like unsubstantiated rules, if you like, imposed by the system operator. So I'll stop there and then probably come back to the discussion later on. Thank you.
Well, moving to yet another continent. And we really are from lots of different continents here in Asia, North America, Europe. Well, in your experience, how do you believe we should model the integration of renewables over time, especially when thinking about energy transition pathways, such as in your EEG analysis of Ethiopia?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. The short answer is in lots of different ways, most appropriate to the particular question that we're asking. But I'll focus on the EE project that we're working on at KTH. And this is a project led by UCL, and we're working in partnership with our colleagues in Ethiopia in Addis Ababa of Technology and Policy Studies Institute. So we're interested in looking at the Ethiopian power system and its development over time. And Ethiopia is one of the fastest growing countries in Africa, so it's going through this process of fast, or has been through very fast economic growth. And so looking into the future, we see this very large or quick expansion of the power system. And one of the main renewable resources and one of the cheapest available resources available to Ethiopia is hydropower, of course. They have a massive hydropower resource. And so we've been investigating this and developed an open source energy system model. So looking at quite a sort of crude way, the use of hydropower for supplying electricity into the future. However, this really provides only part of the story, because Ethiopia, as a rapidly developing country, also has a great need to electrify its population to improve energy access. And so what we've been looking at in conjunction with the sort of supply side modeling we've been doing is how to electrify, how to roll out then energy access to the population. And we've been using a different model, the onset model, which is explicitly spatial and looks at how to extend the existing transmission network if it's cost effective to do so, or alternatively to use a standalone, often solar photovoltaic installations, or to set up mini grids. So in terms of understanding then the performance and the use of, or the applicability of renewables in a power system, we really need to understand the local context, what resources are available, and also use different types of models in order to understand like completely different modeling paradigms, if you like, to understand which renewable technologies would be most appropriate in these different circumstances.
Thank you, Ranjit. You use very explicitly different models and different approaches to think about the energy pathways. You also use a concept called multi-criteria analysis. Can you tell us a little bit more about the strength of your methodologies?
Sure, thanks, Ben. And thanks for inviting me on this panel. So I'll answer this question through the lens of the EEG project that we are working on. We are looking at optimal energy pathways in Southern Africa and 12 different countries with our partners. The SADC Center for Energy Efficiency, Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. Some of them I see on the attendees list, which is great. So in addition to these optimal energy pathways, and when we say optimal, it's usually economically optimal pathways subject to different technical and economic constraints, we also wanted to see how these pathways would differ under different constraints, including environmental and socioeconomic constraints. So we use different sort of sets of models that we bring together in a larger framework. So for example, we use our open source multi-criteria assessment for renewable energy, MAP-RE platform. These are Python-based tools, spatial analysis that looks at where we can install different wind and solar technologies in the future, subject to different environmental and social constraints, and how that would affect optimal energy pathways. We use our VICRIS model, which models hydropower energy budgets, how much hydropower may be available in the future. We are also using CMIP model data, so climate model data, to look at how these energy budgets would be affected in the future, and then bringing it all together in a optimization model called GridPath, which is also an open source modeling platform that we released last year that optimizes generation and transmission investments for the future that will allow us to explore what the total system costs are. You want to bring it all together to then compare system costs across different scenarios to then say, okay, subject to these constraints, how would these costs vary, and then what would be the pathway that policymakers should take to make it a really, truly sustainable energy transition.
Got a number of questions from the audience, and maybe Simon, if you could pick out a few or all of them, and we could address those.
Sure. I mean, I think one is on sort of quality of data as an issue for modelling, and particularly in the sort of context, I guess, of the regions that the EEG is particularly focused on, so Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And so that question is you know, the sense is, well, the question is saying that the data is usually, but not always or exclusively, an issue in such regions, and so how useful are models in those contexts? So the one question is sort of quality of data, contextual issues, and how useful modelling is. And then maybe a second question is around national ownership of models and inclusivity and sort of transparency of models to ensure that they're not black boxes and that they continue to be able to be used after they're initially created by governments and decision makers, and how important is that in the process? I think maybe those are two interesting questions to start with.
So maybe beginning with the question around data quality, Jyoti, perhaps.
Yeah, well,
looking at
data quality, I think it improves as people see the relevance of the questions and the solutions that we suggest. I've seen the huge change over time about when people begin to use and get engaged with our exercises. They begin to ask questions and they look for data. So it does improve. Quality usually is poor in the beginning, but as and when the answers are there, people do change. But the other question that Simon had about the ownership of the national governments, I think we, from the very beginning, that was our modus operandi, where everything we did, we worked with, Nepal Electricity Authority or Bhutan or Bangladesh PPDB and so on, and CEA here as well as CRC in India. So it was a problem solving of course on site kind of a thing where people who were there knew what the situation was. And to give example also, we did the mock power exchange type of exercises and called all the grid operators and taught them how to operate based on demand supply and not just power purchase agreement. But at this point, my demand is this, my supply is this, and I can get it from here. This was simulation exercise we did with them. And I'm happy to say that just a couple of weeks ago, actually India Energy Exchange and Nepal Electricity Authority exchanged power on this basis, where they were, they actually traded far more power than power purchase agreements between governments. So only governments were negotiating these contracts on a long-term basis, and now there is demand supply principle with the related costs for that transaction is something that's understood and applied and used for transferring the power.
And to what extent does, you touched on, you combined almost two aspects here, and I wonder a little bit to what extent the process of engaging that also helps improve data quality. Deb, also as part of the World Bank mandate, how do you think about these?
No, so when we did this simulation exercise, they had to bring data for their work, and gradually it happened. There was what we call it South Asia Regional Power Exchange Surplex exercise was done. And so that's what I'm saying, that people, when they know that this can be used for this kind of decision, the data begins to come around, and far more interest is there in also how to use it.
Deb, what's your view?
Yes, so just building on what Dr. Parikh said, actually back in '90, when I was her PhD student, we initiated the process of data collection for Indian National Grid. And there was barely any data. And then it was really sort of primary data collection. But if I compare that with the latest exercise that I've done with the Indian system operator for the last 2 years to develop a dispatch model that they're using in real time now, and that's saving them close to $150 million per year now. It's quite amazing. And that's a very thin layer of optimization on top of everything. So as she said, it's driven very much by where people see the value. And as part of World Bank over the last 7-8 years, that has been my life, basically going to the clients and asking for data and showing them the value proposition. And we have actually collected now electricity planning model data, say, for more like 90 countries now. And we also have a electricity planning model, what we fondly call EPM, that's available with all of that data. We are going to make it publicly available. And I see a lot of strong interest when we can actually successfully demonstrate the value proposition. So I'll stop there and come back later if necessary. Thanks.
Will, maybe you on your perspective, and I think one thing I personally always wonder, especially with regards to data quality, is how granular should a model also be, especially when thinking about something like power dispatch and then broadening it to the wider energy system questions. There is a hypothesis, at least, that level of detail on the one hand helps you answer more questions, and at the same time it forces you to assemble so much data that you arguably lose degrees of freedom, that you lose insight because you compound forecasting errors. Is that something you agree with?
It's something I think about a lot. You're right. I think you have to find this sweet spot when you're modeling. You don't want to model at too fine a detail where you start actually introducing uncertainty into your modeling results. But you don't also want to model at so coarse a scale that you don't really really get the required detail and understanding of the mechanisms of the system that you're trying to represent. And that's becoming increasingly challenging, actually, or that challenge is becoming very sort of noticeable now with the increased penetration of renewables. Because we need to model at more spatially detailed scales and also temporally detailed scales as well. We need to understand much more about when the sun is going to shine and the wind is going to blow and it's going to rain, and how that affects then the stream flow in the rivers, which fills our hydropower reservoirs. And also the timing then of those electricity demands and other energy demands. So that introduces a sort of whole another set of problems, or data problems, and you get into this realm of sort of then having to manage a lot of data and somehow work out. It compounds the issue of data quality, if you like. So in the good old days when you just had dispatchable power plants, and you could get away maybe with working at with lower resolution data, and therefore data quality was less of an immediate issue. Our experience in Ethiopia showed that it's so important to have local partners who are really knowledgeable about the local energy system and have been working, of course, with their national energy system for a long time, and that made gathering data and building on their efforts much easier. So I think that's the other thing that's just really important is, if you're working in partnership with people in countries, make sure that you really make use of their knowledge and are able to contribute then back, and that's something we're very happy to do as well. At the end of the EEG project, we're going to be opening up the energy system model and providing that with documentation, and so that our local partners will be able to then build on that in the future. So that maybe that goes back into a little bit into the national ownership as well, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, and Ranjit, the national ownership part and transparency of these models, that's a key part of your work. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what you're doing there.
Sure. And first, I want to say that whatever Will say, I would have used the exact same answer for which is applicable to our project as well. So in terms of transparency, we are really so we're grateful, of course, for our partners on the ground who are collecting all the data and giving us all this demand data, etc. One thing I want to add is for data sets that we didn't have access to, there's some really great satellite products now that we could potentially use and bring them into models, especially in our hydropower modeling. We were able to sort of gather those or create those data sets as well. In terms of transparency, our models are all open source. The MapRE spatial model. So we develop these platforms and then we provide data sets that go along with those platforms. So our grid path optimization model is a set of Python and Biomo optimization scripts. And that platform is available on GitHub. If we had to develop a model which is region or country specific, what we do is we just give them or give our stakeholders and anybody for that matter, a database that goes along with that model. You marry the two, and then you get a fully functioning, transparent model, which is really important because there's so many models out there. There's so many papers and reports, and modeling results can change significantly with certain assumptions. And not everybody has the time to go into them, and especially if they're not transparent, we don't know how, like, what's the basis of these results. making these models transparent and open source allows at least some researchers to go in and check the validity of these results, which is important, and gives certain legitimacy to our results as well. So in terms of ownership, I also want to say that it's not enough to just make the models open source. It also is important to have training workshops where stakeholders in the country are able to use these models, because they're fairly complicated models to use. And our hope is with these training workshops, we'll have at least a few teams within these different countries that we work in who will use these models for future policymaking.
Thanks. And I mean, I should sort of declare the slight bias, both I personally and as an EG program we have on this as well. One of the things we do as an energy and economic growth program is to act as the secretariat for the Roundtable Initiative on Strategic Energy Planning, that in fact a number of leading organizations, including FCDO, IRADe, as well as some universities like UCL have signed up for. And it's really around some key principles, including national ownership, coherence and inclusivity, capacity, robustness, transparency and accessibility, to ensure that models do in fact help the countries directly that they're intended for. But Simon, there have been quite a few more questions coming through, I can see. Maybe we can take a few more.
Yeah, I'll pick two areas maybe again. So there's a couple of questions around the sort of integration of variable renewable energies into the grid, and sort of how that's handled in modelling terms and technical issues of that, type of models that might be used, and also sort of looking at variable demands and demand side management alongside sort of variable renewables. So yeah, I guess the question there is to what extent a model is used to handle the technical issues related to that, and what type of models. And then maybe on another topic, we've got a question around, are there models that bring in non-sector energy imperatives into modelling work to help with decision-making processes? So sort of environmental externalities, employment benefits, health impacts, and so on. I hope that's clear. So sort of two sets of questions there.
Thanks, Simon. So I mean, maybe starting with the first one, what type of models are most effective then to look at integration as well as demand side management?
From
maybe.
our point, are you asking? Am I going? Okay.
Sure.
From our point of view, I think we did it in two ways. One is the map for mapping a long-term future. We did it in a macro way. But then, so it is like, where is this bus going? And then once we decide that, then when we come back to the granular things and, hourly dispatch and that sort of the details, seasonal details and so on. So over the year, the load curves and how the two countries exchange every hour and then later on every 15 minutes. That this is both are necessary. So going back and forth, actually, we find it you get more, because first one is needed for long-term policies that governments have to take, whereas the other one is whether actually the power sector people can work with this and what are the questions at their level. And for that purpose, we also see how there is another question, I think, perhaps to me, about why would Nepal buy electricity from because it's cheaper in India and hydropower would be more expensive. But in the electricity sector, there is usually a range of prices at different times of the hour, different times of the day. And when the prices of solar were high, there was a different pattern of this trade. But when we are through EEG, we are modeling declining prices of solar, and then the trade pattern is changing, because now with the declining solar, it is much more into a certain time of the run-of-the-river plants and with pondage are being used during the daytime. On a daily basis, whereas in the hydropower plant with large storage are being used on a seasonal support. So seasonal support and daily support. So that's how it is changing with prices also. So still we find that it's possible to use, even though the declining prices have fallen. And of course, they are also.
Thank you very much. You've answered an additional question now, which I also saw flash up on the chat box, which was around the question why trade at all. But and then there's a question maybe we can come back to around how models can help us understand these benefits. But maybe going back to this original question, what type of models should we really use, or how do we actually decide which kind of modeling approach to take to a particular question? And perhaps stepping beyond integration and demand-side management, there's a huge question, I think, around energy efficiency. How do you even model that? Maybe Deb, starting with you, how do you go about deciding which modeling approach to take or which type of model to choose?
Yeah, I'll try my best, Ben. As I see it with renewable, as well as, if you like, demand response, which is sort of a subcategory within sort of demand side management, there are like three typical issues. One is at a very, very, like if you like millisecond level inertia type of issues. Then there is short-term variability, and then there is actually long-term variability of variable renewable energy. And there's a lot of attention on the first two categories. With the inertia, we do need sort of power system dynamic models, and they need to be calibrated for each country, which is a big ask. Canada did an exercise only 2 years ago, and it took them 2 years to do that. We are going through that in India at the moment. But yeah, once those models are calibrated, we actually get parameters for higher level models like dispatch, planning, and so on. It essentially answers the question on what is the minimum level of inertia that the system needs in any condition of renewable energy. Then the short-term variability part can be handled through a good representation of spinning reserve. And that's pretty common in dispatch models, and also becoming very common in long-term planning models. So we kind of use that quite effectively. Like we can have different level of granularity on how many kinds of reserve, fast reserve, slow reserve. What is not addressed very well in most of the analysis is the long-term variability of wind and solar. And then we understand that very well for hydro, and it's modeled quite well, but nobody talks about wind drought, what happens to like slowly changing patterns of solar radiation. And this is actually becoming, it is already an issue in places like India. Like just before the monsoon, wind disappears, and it might be at 20% level or close to 0% level. So we did some analysis for Turkey, India, etc., and we found pretty significant difference. I became very unpopular within the bank because it sounded like I'm opposing renewables, but it is a big issue, and it will become a bigger issue with higher penetration. So those are the three categories, and I think there are different models to deal with that. Thank you.
Ranjit, what's your take going to the other question that was posed on how much else to look at? How do you incorporate environmental health factors, climate change that just mentioned? What sort of, how much to throw into these models, and how then to make sense of it?
That's a great question, Ben. So there are some parts of this question that you can use as inputs to the model. and some you can look at what the outputs are in terms of impacts. So to give an example, in terms of inputs, we can introduce more environmental constraints on renewable energy siting, hydropower siting, which sort of limits the what we call candidate sites that are available to these models to choose from. And that allows us to then compare different scenarios, but you want to sort of change things one at a time to see what the effect of those different factors are, rather than throwing everything in and changing everything at the same time. And in terms of outputs, we can look at health outputs, local air pollution outputs from conventional power plants, how that is changing, and then translate that to public health benefits. But at least in my work, we haven't brought those health benefits or local environmental pollution as inputs and optimize for minimizing that those particular impacts as well. But we can look at these different criteria and then sort of compare it on a common metrics. And usually that is, system cost, because that is how the consumers are going to pay. It's going to finally be translated into consumer tariffs.
Well, if we think about this question of the energy transition, there's also jobs, and if you mentioned a number of modeling approaches, how do you choose what to include there, and how do you, perhaps using Ranjit's description there of inputs versus outputs, what do you optimize for, and how is it then relevant for policy making? You have quite a comprehensive approach there. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more.
Sure, I think it's really important to start with the question that you're trying to answer. So if you're trying to support some policy making, then you need to talk to the policymakers and really find out what it is they're asking. Are they worried about integration of renewables? Are they worried about jobs and what will happen to employment if a coal mine is closed, or if a huge new sort of rollout of solar PV begins across the country? So once you have those questions, then you can really begin to select the modeling approaches. And I think Deb described the sort of technical, the more sort of detailed techie side of those modeling approaches quite well. I would add maybe a fourth one, which is this sort of long-term energy system planning, which does quite a bad job of modeling the integration of renewables. Normally, it sort of just includes this all in one parameter, the reserve margin, and says, well, you need to have a certain percentage of the capacity available to provide backup when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. So that's a very crude sort of approximation of the detailed modeling actually needed to answer this type of question. But it does allow you then to focus your computation and questions on answering a different question, which is, well, what renewables do we actually need in the first place? And that's maybe a key question. So in terms of jobs and trying to understand the impact of jobs, well, again, maybe that requires a different modeling approach. And you begin to then think about how we couple models to one another. Maybe we go down the road of looking at a computable general equilibrium model, or some more specialist sort of economic model, and then sending or populating the inputs for that model with outputs from a long-term energy system model. So you end up with a sort of suite of models that talk to one another in either hard-linked or soft-linked together, and together they begin to provide a bigger picture. And obviously that requires the resources and the knowledge and capacity to do that. So again, it comes back to what question do you want to answer to focus then the modeling effort.
Simon, I think we have time for one more round of questions, perhaps from the audience. Is there Is there something that's come through?
There's one here that we haven't really touched on yet, I don't think, which is how relevant is modelling in the production of long-term price forecasts for electricity, given the sort of cost dynamics of renewables? Are there any reliable tools for dealing with those cost dynamics? I'm assuming that they're talking about the sort of transition, the fall in price of things like solar, I'm guessing. Yeah.
I think maybe Ranjit, starting with you on that one, is that something you're looking at? The question of how do you forecast price, and how relevant then is that to, well, we know price and cost matter hugely to investors, but in these modeling approaches, how do you optimize for that?
So I want to make it clear that our models are not forecasting models, and we are not trying to forecast a future. We're looking at different futures, and given the uncertainty of certain parameters, what would be a safe sort of approach to take in terms of policymaking? So in our models, when we want to look at what the effect of different price paths for solar or wind technologies that have rapidly changing costs, we look at multiple scenarios. What happens if the price stays the same across future years? What happens when it falls by 2% per year or something? And these are forecasts from international agencies, but we also know that many of those are notoriously erroneous, looking at past data. And oftentimes we have seen wind and solar prices actually fall much faster than what these past projections have been. So we look at these scenarios and then say, okay, given these potential pathways, should we be going for more renewables or less? Another main point that I want to make is it is, of course, important to understand how the energy system is going to evolve over the next 10, 20 years, etc. But in terms of planning, in the past, when we were installing a lot of conventional energy generators like coal thermal power plants, nuclear, these would take years to build. Now, wind and solar projects can be built within 1 to at most 2 years. Even battery storage systems can be built like within a year or so. So in terms of planning these systems, like we can have short-term planning and continuously run our models to then see how this power system should evolve from a country perspective. So that's sort of one part of the question that I sort of understood and how we incorporate the different potential price paths. Another interpretation of that question was also how the prices would evolve in terms of wholesale electricity prices, which might be important for investing in perhaps wind and solar projects which are trading on the market. And these long-term models are also important to understand those prices, because those prices are going to change significantly as we have more what we call zero marginal cost wind and solar on the system. And I'll stop there.
So that's interesting. So you're talking about this as a sort of less of a forecasting and more of a piece to inform discussion to the thinking, the longer term planning and strategic questions. But Jyoti, you touched on this earlier in your earlier remark of prices really matter when you talk about power trading, and you gave the example of a change that's recently occurred. So how do you forecast price?
Sometimes
when cross-border and data quality, going back to that point, may be a real challenge. Maybe we can link it back to that.
Yeah, we sometimes make a price assumption and see its implications in transfers, or sometimes shadow prices that do come in on the optimization model, which gives some indication. And one other thing I wanted to mention when I see that how the economy gets vitalized when you say job, but we are looking at the macroeconomic consequences also. And so what are the export earnings, how the energy access improves, and how the export earnings, and also the GDP itself becomes in vigor. So GDP growth is much more. In Nepal's case, for example, 40% of the GDP, 40% increase of GDP you can see with trade and no trade. And so it kind of, you can see the dynamics where in the beginning, agriculture sector is a large share, then industry happens. You can see that industry is growing because of access to power, then service economy is growing. And so you could see these growth dynamics. If you have a macroeconomic model linked to the power sector, which is also one exercise we have done, though it's a little difficult, especially in this region, because the input-output model is not available for, except in India is a little bit better. But the other countries, we have to struggle to get it done. But we have done some work in that area.
Will, going perhaps to you, what's your view?
Then could you repeat the question? I've just been replying to some in the question and answer session. So I'm sorry, I wasn't listening.
No, that's I wasn't trying to catch you out there. Don't worry.
You caught me out.
I think the question is about the how you forecast price, but in particular in this sense of integrating perhaps countries, or wondering then. In some sense, I think Jyoti touched on almost an endogeneity problem, which is that what do you control for when everything is interlinked, the economy and so on, yet we have to make decisions. So short of this full computable general equilibrium approach, how do you forecast price? What does it mean to you to do it?
We don't forecast price, and we don't claim to. So I think I'd be extremely nervous making any kind of claims like that. But we can give some kind of indication, right, as a sort of output of our model of the cost of generating electricity, say, under different scenarios, as has been sort of described by Ranjit and others. So, I mean, one thing we look at is how technology costs change over time, and obviously that changes then the makeup of the energy system. So as solar costs come down and say nuclear gets expensive, just to randomly pick two technologies, then you would see in an optimization framework anyway, you would see a changing portfolio of technologies appearing in your energy system. And as you change your assumptions about the costs of those technologies and how they change over time, that portfolio would change. And given that, you can then explore then what that means for the cost of generating electricity and extrapolate what that would mean for prices. So we're certainly not doing any forecasting, but we can get some idea that, from the modeling results of what this would mean in terms of affordability. And that would need to be taken, of course, in contrast to the counterfactual scenario, which is say if you, I don't know, it might be under dangerous climate change, or it might be with very high pollution levels. So, and of course, some of these aspects might then not be covered in or priced into the model. So it's something that's a little bit more complicated to do, and would require a sort of post-analysis after the types of models that we use.
Deb, I mean, you have that dual function in some sense here of wanting to produce an intellectual piece of research, and the question there is how relevant is price forecast. But you also work for the World Bank that makes or underwrites investments underpinned by long-term forecasts. So So what's your view, and what's the importance here of models in helping inform investment decisions?
Yeah, quite massive, really, especially with the type of countries and sort of client organizations that we deal with, where typically the capacity is quite low for the planning bodies and the regulatory bodies there to inform investment decisions. It partly relates to poor quality of data, partly relates to the lack of capacity for them to do the modeling. So we have the kind of responsibility in that sense to empower them with models, tools, data, etc. And yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, like, it has been a huge challenge for us to promote renewables as much as we would like to see everything turning green overnight. We have had very little success in Africa. So I see personally a huge role, and that's pretty much sort of my life over the last 7-8 years, to more or less do the analytical service. And it has been, you know, we are making progress, not as fast as we would like, but we are getting there, I think.
And when we know costs,
On that,
we know costs.
Jyoti, I'm sorry to cut you off there. We unfortunately are out of time, but and I quite like Deb's optimistic note of we are making progress, but there's more to go, more to try. And but I also take away from this discussion here that models can be part of the discussion and part of the suite of tools we use to inform decision as well as policy making. And the question I think that's come up multiple times is around the national ownership and the clarity, which questions do we actually answer. We did also touch on a range of methodological questions, which tools are best, and the question of are there new innovative ways, and that part is the focus of our third webinar taking place on the 27th of May. And there we really hope to delve a little deeper into some of these new innovative ways of modeling the frontiers, be they probabilistic, the computer general equilibrium modeling, but also agent-based or machine learning tools, and some of the other ways of which there are undoubtedly countless. I'm quite excited to learn about it. I do hope you, the audience, will join us for that. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panel for joining today. I hope everyone enjoyed the question. We will follow up with a reminder to everyone about the forthcoming seminar. We are also happy to take questions offline and respond to the degree possible. Thank you, everyone, for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ben.
So this concludes today's webinar. Thank you.